Hi guys, here's part 2 of Cities, Inequalities, and New Social Realities lecture. Again, in this one I'm going to do a lot of talking. You're going to see a lot of words on the slides, but it's going to be up to you to pick out the most important or the most interesting things to write down on your notes. Now, these early civilizations were vastly different from the old Neolithic cities and villages. They were impersonal, and it was no longer possible to know everyone on that personal level. Class and occupation were at least as important as family relationships and kinship. As well, like we know, there was an increase in specialization as agricultural surplus freed some people from different tasks. And this specialization and freedom from tasks led to an increase in inequalities with hierarchies built on class. To begin, the upper class wasn't necessarily richer. They had more wealth in land and in salaries, but they were considered upper class because they could avoid physical labor. And as you move down the class hierarchy pyramid, you'll notice that the lower you go, the more physical labor you'll need to complete. A great example of class hierarchy is Mesopotamia's Code of Hammurabi. This is the first written law code done during the Babylonian Empire by the good King Hammurabi, and it was 282 written laws that were posted all throughout the kingdom on pillars for people to see and read. And it's where we get the very famous saying, "An eye for an eye justice." Law number 196 reads, "If a man puts out the eye of another man, his eye shall be put out." Law 195 says, "If a son strikes his father, his hands shall be cut off." But in reality, this wasn't an eye for an eye justice. It wasn't equal for everyone. There were class divisions, and punishments were based on social classes. Especially if it were a slave that struck another man, that slave would be put to death. Or if it was a man that struck a woman, that man would have to pay a kind of fine to the woman's father. If it were a lower class man who in some way wronged an upper class man, that lower class man would be punished far more worse than if an upper class man had in some way done wrong to a lower class man. For the most part of these societies, we have individuals that we call today free commoners. These are artisans, low-level officials, soldiers, police or law enforcement, servants, and a bunch of farmers. Now, the way that these people would pay their taxes was never through wealth, was never through any kind of money. And this goes back to the whole idea of bartering your service or your goods for another service or another good. An agricultural surplus would be appropriated through taxes, through rent, through required labor, through some kind of tribute system that would support the upper class. As a matter of fact, the oldest paycheck ever found in history was recently discovered this summer, where the employer paid his worker, he was a manual laborer of some kind, in the form of beer. He got beer for his labor. Many of these civilizations, all of them, it could be argued, had some form of slaves, and slavery was constantly at the bottom of the social hierarchy, and we have to remember that slavery in the ancient time is not racially or ethnically based. Slaves were usually captured as prisoners of war, they were people who owed a debt, or they were people that committed a crime, and they're at the bottom of the social hierarchy, and slavery was practiced in these early civilizations, but varied depending on region and culture. For example, China never had a significantly large population, especially compared to Mesopotamia and Teotihuacan. Mesopotamia and Teotihuacan were known for their warlike societies and were constantly gaining slaves through conquest as prisoners of war, right? Teotihuacan's entire existence, their whole social standing and belief was that everything depended on the sacrifice of prisoners and slaves to their gods. Now, China was also a warring state, but they were mostly at war with northern nomadic tribes where there wasn't large populations of settled individuals that you could draw slaves from. Instead, what China does is they use their free commoner population to complete that manual labor, to complete that physical labor that slaves were used to do in Teotihuacan and in Mesopotamia. With the rise of civilizations, we get the rise of the patriarchy. What I need you to do is I need you to define patriarchy as the control of society by men of a disproportionately large share of power. One more time. Control by men of a disproportionately large share of power. With men controlling what happens in public and women being relegated to the home, the patriarchy, capital P patriarchy, was established during this time. Men replaced women in agricultural work. The use of animal-drawn plows would favor men's naturally larger upper body strength. Farms were often placed at a distance from villages, and this could also favor men, as it was more difficult for women to pack up children and offspring and take them to the village. Increased food production led to increased population, which means women are having more children to have to take care of. And women were more often pregnant, making it difficult for them to become reliable labor sources. And with the rise of these civilizations, we also get the rise of large-scale warfare. And these large-scale military conflicts with professional armies also favored men. Social organization marked by the supremacy of the father in the clan or the family during that Neolithic time, the legal dependence of women and children, and the reckoning of descent and the inheritance of the male line, the patrilineal descent, all emerges in that late transition of Neolithic village to first civilizations. Now, very quickly, we should look at the differences between these between these civilizations, primarily between Mesopotamia and Egypt. And I would argue that the very foundation of their differences comes from their relationship to their environment. In Mesopotamia, we have the flooding of the unpredictable and the violent flooding of the Tigris and the Euphrates River. They also have a very open environment where there are no geographical barriers. So while it makes it easy to travel, to do trade, to learn new cultures, it also makes them very vulnerable to invasion. So what emerged in Mesopotamia was a very warlike society that was constantly changing as new invaders would come in and take over. Mesopotamia also believed that they were at the mercy of capricious and very whimsical gods, and that's because of their environment, trying to figure out why are the gods punishing us by flooding our crops, by taking our villages and moving them down the river because of this violent flood. And as a result, there isn't a very positive outlook held by Mesopotamians on life. There really is no afterlife, as we can see in such stories as the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the moral of the story is when you die, you die and you're at peace, and that's the best thing that could happen in your life. Now, compared to Egypt, where they relied on the Nile River, where the flooding was cyclical, it was seasonal, where it was very mild flooding and it was very reliable. The Nile also offered protection, as well as the fact that Egypt could be protected by the Mediterranean Sea in the north, by the Red Sea in the east, by the cataracts of the Nile River to the south, and the desert that was to the west. Egypt, for a large part of its history, started to emerge in a bubble, and we get a very unique Egyptian culture, right? When you think of Egypt, there are very specific things that come to your head, whereas when you think of Mesopotamia, well, first you have to think about what the heck Mesopotamia is and where it is. But Egypt, that's an ingrained idea that we have. Egyptians also believed in an afterlife, and that life was eternal, cyclical, and seasonal like the Nile River. And we see that in their belief in reincarnation, of life and death, and of their belief in the afterlife. And finally, it's important that we look at the conquests and the changes that occurred during these first civilizations. Now, we get the first civilizations, and really it's only a couple millennia before those civilizations start to butt up against each other in empire building and in large-scale warfare. And that first begins in Mesopotamia, when stronger people in northern Mesopotamia who have this new technology of iron smelting, where their swords and their shields and their weapons are stronger, and they end up moving south down to the Sumerians. First, we have the Akkadian Empire, the very first empire in all of history. Next came the Babylonians with the famous King Nebuchadnezzar, and finally the Assyrians are the last of these first big empires. Now, along with the pillaging and the killing and the stealing, this empire building process also beget to trade and influencing each other. The greatest examples of that were the Hebrews, who were influenced by the Code of Hammurabi's eye for an eye justice. And we can see that in the Ten Commandments. We can see that in the Old Testament. Another huge, enormous, just entirely influential influence was the Phoenicians who developed the first ever alphabet, the alphabet that the Greeks would then borrow, the alphabet that the Romans would then borrow, and the entire Latin alphabet that we use today for modern-day English was inspired by cuneiform, which would have never happened if these first empires had not started to conquer this area. All right, guys, that's all I have. Thanks so much.